So we have here today Professor Cesâreo Bandera from Department of Romance Studies from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who has kindly agreed to talk to us about his memories of Professor René Girard and how René Girard had an impact on him and what are some of the memories he has of him. So let me start off by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor René Girard?
Okay, through Professor John Freccero at Cornell University. John Freccero was the director of my doctoral dissertation at Cornell. He had been teaching at Johns Hopkins prior to coming to Cornell. There he had met René Girard already. At some point, René Girard accepted an offer from SUNY Buffalo. That was in 1968. On his way from Baltimore to Buffalo, he stopped at John Freccero's house. And John Freccero had a little dinner party, I don't remember the date, on 1968, in which I was invited precisely for the purpose of meeting Professor Girard, whom Freccero thought.
Is that Cornell?
Yes. Ithaca, that's where Cornell is.
Okay, yes.
Freccero thought that we would be very good friends. He thought that I would like René Girard and what René Girard was doing, and vice versa. And he was right. So I saw him very briefly on that dinner party in '68. And then when I joined, following him, I joined SUNY Buffalo the following year in 1969. He was already there, and we renewed our brief encounter and became very close, very good friends. We would meet for lunch at the faculty club practically every day for long periods of time. And that's how the whole thing developed. We started to, at that time, he was already working on his first anthropological book, Violence.
Sander Goodhart was there as well, wasn't he?
Yes, Sandy Goodhart was a student. In fact, during absences from the committee, sometimes Professor Girard had to be away for one reason or another. When that happened, I substituted for him in the doctoral committee for Sandy Goodhart. So I knew Sandy Goodhart quite well. He was not my student, but I was, a substitute member of his doctoral committee, if there is such a thing. And of course, we became very good friends, and we have remained very good friends, Sandy and myself too.
I see. So you were saying Professor Girard was working on violence and the sacred when you met him.
Yes, he was still, and you see, there was a difference in his attitude when we talked almost daily on these lunches at the faculty club. Normally, we would be talking about literary things because the book that I was familiar with was his first book, Mensonges antiques et vérités romanesques, Deceit, Desire, and the novel. And so we would talk about Cervantes or Shakespeare or Molière or whatever. But occasionally he would bring up this new subject of which I knew very little, but that it was clear to me it was something deeper. His attitude would change. He would become quieter, more meditative, and some of his vivaciousness would subside. I noticed that, although I was not fully aware of what was going on. Much later, as a matter of fact, it's not that long ago that I read somewhere that that was one of the most difficult periods in his life, where he would go from, psychologically speaking, from elation and great enthusiasm to periods of depression. Some of that, on retrospect, I can see was present in our meetings. But I learned more of what was going on through Eugenio Donato, who had been a student and collaborator of his at Johns Hopkins and came with him to Buffalo. And so I knew this was about this anthropological project, etc., etc. Eugenio Donato died very young and unexpectedly, and so I didn't learn much from him. So one day, one memorable day, in the town of East Aurora in western New York, about 20 miles south of Buffalo, where René's home was, just over a cup of coffee, I finally asked him, please tell me, what in the world is it all about? Okay, I mean, I know you've been working on this thing intensely. Tell me, what is it all about? So he became very serious and just looking straight into my eyes. I mean, that was a moment that in my life I will never forget. He simply said, I am convinced I can demonstrate the transition from animal to man. Just like that, nothing more. I looked at him, a little bit stunned. I didn't know how to react. So I joked aloud, René, you shouldn't say those things in a loud voice. People may think you're crazy, I mean, he continued to be very serious. He said, no, I am serious. I am convinced I can do it. And that's it. The rest is history. I don't know exactly what the day for that memorable moment, but it certainly was significantly earlier than the publication of Violence and the Sacred. I know that at some point, he wasn't yet clear what the title of the book would be. He thought of something like Anthropologie structurale, but then eventually at some point he decided on Violence and the Sacred. And that was it. I was enthusiastic about it. Basically, for people of deep religious background, such as I was, that meant that in a way he was providing a scientific basis, a totally scientific frame of reference to understand the Christ event, the passion, death, and resurrection. He was simply saying, this is how an animal came into being. In other words, this same framework before Christ is really the framework in which humanity came to be. I can demonstrate this passage from animal to man in a strictly scientific way without even mentioning God, the Christian God, or any kind of religious belief. Okay, he insisted on this quite firmly. That never convinced me. I told
him. Convince you?
They convinced me about the skateboard mechanism, which was what he had discovered, right. The frame of reference of Christ, and also the beginning of humanity. what did not convince me at all is that he was determined not to mention Christ at all, that he could keep his religious faith completely separate from his anthropological scientific work. That never convinced me, quite frankly, and that has continued to be the case. But so finally the book was published, and all of a sudden I didn't see.
Did he make sense when he was telling you that his theory and discovery? Did you make sense?
Oh, absolutely. He made complete sense. I was enthusiastic about it. What I could not understand is his insistence that, this is completely scientific. I can do it without any reference to my religious belief. And that is the part that I didn't think was going to work. And I'm still thinking like that today. But there is this little anecdote. Somebody, I don't remember who, told me that La Violence et le Sacré had been announced, came up in this afternoon newspaper in France, Le Monde, as the first atheistic demonstration of the origin and relevance of religion. Atheistic. So it caught me by surprise. One day I asked René, is this true? I didn't see them. And he then, whispered to me, with a very ironic smile on his face. Yeah, don't tell anybody. I suggested this phrase to the reporter. It was my idea to say that it is atheistic. And I laughed with him and so forth, but in my mind, I said, this is not going to work. This is not, First of all, he did not convince, he wanted to convince a reputable anthropologist. That's what he was aiming at, to find a place in the human sciences to be accepted as a serious anthropologist. Very, very, very few accepted. In other words, he could not fool anybody, really. Everybody knew where he was coming from. He was no atheist at all. He was a man that not everybody knew that he had gone through a religious conversion, but many people knew, and he would never hide it, that he was a very religious man, a devout Catholic, So, but anyhow, those were our beginnings.
But he wasn't really very forward about his Catholicism when he wrote Mensonges Romantiques. It was just a subtext. People really didn't know he was a Catholic at that point. La Violence et le Sacré was really all about scapegoating and anthropology at that point. He wanted to keep the Judeo-Christian discovery for his next book.
Exactly.
That's what he was doing.
Yes. However, in a book that I am writing now, and that I hope it will be finished very soon, I touch on that because, yes, he wanted to. The original project was to write both something like Violence and the Sacred and something on Christianity.
Right.
But he couldn't do it.
It was too big.
So he wrote, devoted his attention exclusively to the scientific part of it, Violence and the Sacred. But he was worried about it. This was the this was the irony of the situation. On the one hand, he insisted on the possibility of doing science, strictly science, about, you know, the importance of religion and so forth, but in a totally scientific. On the other hand, he knew that at a deeper level, that discovery of his, in other words, to see at the origin, in a totally anthropological way, the same framework as that of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, that was not an accident. He knew he owed his scientific discovery to his religious conviction. He knew that. And he felt very uneasy about the relationship between these two things. And this is why, after publishing Violence and the Sacred, he became seriously preoccupied. And he told me on a few occasions that he thought that perhaps he should have written the book on Christianity first, and then Violence and the Sacred. In other words, he felt that would have been more honest in a way, would have been more in accordance with what really had happened, which is that, you know, he would have never, he was convinced of that, he would have never made that scientific discovery except for his very firm religious belief and religious background. But there you are, you know.
Bandera, wasn't that part of his intellectual journey from literature? He went to study mythology.
Absolutely, yes, yes, you're right, and he has continued. This is, you know, somebody, I think it was...
He wasn't really ready for Christianity. He needed to study mythology first before he could write about Christianity, before he could write about Judeo-Christian text. So,
yes. On the logical level, at the level of science, yes, that's what he did. That's what he did. But the underground story is, it was the reverse. In other words, take before anthropology, Dicite, Desire and the mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque. Okay. Yeah. He's talking about Cervantes, he's talking about Shakespeare, he's Proust, etc., etc. I'm sorry?
Dostoevsky.
Oh, yes, of course, I forgot. Indeed. Dostoevsky's, together with Cervantes, they are at the very center. Yes, in order to end up a little bit like Don Quixote and Cervantes himself. On his deathbed, you know, this night, we had this, to put it in a Broadway terminology, the impossible dream, ends up repenting and ask God for mercy because he, you know, he had deviated from the path, etc., etc. Well, René ends all these voyage through modern novel to end up with something that he called, could not be called a religious conversion, but something similar to it. There is a kind of conversion.
Sure, which you call holistic conversion, ultimately.
Yes.
Holistic conversion.
Which, in a way, that is the test of greatness. The mediocre novelist, and many of which of the great began as mediocre, never get to that level. And they learn a lot about themselves as they write. And in a way, and I'm quoting René, I don't remember where, This mature genius, novelistic genius, will always have much more in common with the enemies of literary fiction, with the enemies of the theater, for example, in the case of Calderon or Shakespeare, than with the great apologist of literary fiction, because they learn a secret about themselves, which is not necessarily flattering. I could give you quotes from Calderon because I discussed this thing with him rather extensively. But this, you see, it's what you said in a way is it just describes the whole trajectory, intellectual trajectory of René Girard. You see, you have his scientific accomplishment. He showed the study of myths, the study of the birth of the scapegoat mechanism, and so on and so forth. And then comes Christianity. But there is a bigger or deeper truth which goes in exactly the opposite direction, you know, and he knew it. He knew it.
How do you know he knew it? How do you know he knew it?
Because he told me. Because, and as a matter of fact, I have some written evidence of a very personal nature, which I am not at liberty to discuss. But he knew, if I say these things, in other words, if I say that you must begin with what comes historically last. What comes historically last in this is Christ. And Christ makes sense of this because in a way Christ was in the beginning. If I say that, I will have the hounds of hell on me. You see, this cannot be said if I want to be a respectable man of science. But that is, and that has been really my disagreement from the beginning. I was enthusiastic about his discovery. But if you end up by turning the scapegoat mechanism, because, you know, unless you confess to what lies behind this, all you can do, all the scapegoat mechanism can do for you is to reveal the injustice, you know, the massacre of millions of innocent victims from the beginning of the world. Okay, Christ comes along and say, stop it, you know, you cannot do that. You are the guilty parties. Don't put it on the victim. It's your doing, you know, and that is the end, or supposedly that is the end of the victimizing sacrificial mechanism. But if that is the case, you know, I mean, if all we needed was information, it could have sent a sage, a Confucius type of, you know, somebody to say, let me instruct you on the thing. And also something that which I never discussed as I should have done. That was not new knowledge. If we say, okay, Christ came to give us a knowledge which was not possible, or not to that degree, prior to his coming. Only he could really reveal the complete truth about the violence of the victimizing of the victim, so to put it in modern terms. Well, that's not quite true. Virgil, Lucretius had done that. You begin the Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, the Lucretius scientific poem, was saying, look at what religion does. And he talks about the sacrifice of Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon, so that the Greek fleet could sail safely to the conquest of Troy, except that she had to be sacrificed, you know. And look at that. Well, that is religion for you. Huh? And then comes Virgil. And the, let me get rid of this. And Virgil is all about why. Why is this, the entire Roman civilization, that was the res maxima, it was the highest thing on earth. And why does it have to begin with brother against brother? Why the victim? And the victim is, Virgil makes as a point to point out, to emphasize the fact that the victim is totally arbitrary. There is no reason why this victim instead of the other. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't make any difference whether the victim is guilty of anything or an exemplary person. You know, an example of loyalty, such as his helmsman, Palinurus. He is the victim. I mean, Neptune tells Venus, yes, I will grant your wish. The Trojans will reach the Italian shore, but one head must be given up for the sake of many. Who? It doesn't make any difference. Okay? But Virgil keeps asking, why is this so? What is, the sacred is there, but why are these hellish things, these dark things sacred? What is the link between violence, this hellish thing, and the sacred? Well, he doesn't know. He doesn't know. He simply knows that there is a truth which is there, which he doesn't know exactly how to get to it. It is dark. And just he keeps asking why. And Jupiter, he keeps asking Jupiter, of course, is the only god. Not that he or Clovis or any educated Roman at the time believed in the mythology of the gods, but you know, poetically that's for me. But Jupiter tells him, "Hey, I am the god of the Trojans and the Rutulians, of the Italians, which are now fighting each other. Who is going to prevail? It's up to fate. But who is fate? Who knows anything about? That is the big God, to the point where, you know, I mean, all this is in DNA. I mean, it's right there. It's been studied, although most classes didn't know what they were looking at. But it becomes clear when you approach it from a Girardian point of view. When Aeneas leaves Hades, where he had gone to visit the ghost of his father who had died, and his father, Anchises, reveals to him the entire future of the Roman Empire. Okay, and that is true. I mean, everything that he learns, that supposedly Aeneas learns from Father Anchises about in Rome, Virgil had already, it was already happening at the time of Virgil. It was real, it was historical. And yet, as both he and the Sibyl leave Hades to come back to the world outside, they come through the ivory, the ivory door. The ivory, there are two doors out of hell, ivory and bone. Ivory, beautiful prophecies which are not true. Through the other, very dark things which are true. They live through the ivory door. That, you know, all of that was known, was happening. Not just, it is not enough for me to say before Christ, but just before Christ. One generation before Christ, which means that it is no accident that, you know, when Dante needs a pagan to be his guide through hell in the Divine Comedy, whom does he go to? Who is he going to pick up? Of course, Virgil. Virgil is the pagan that came closest to Christ. Saint-Beuve has a famous phrase, you know, Christ, the coming of Christ is nothing surprising once you have read Virgil. That is an exaggeration. I don't believe that, but there is a substantial grain of truth there. And yet, Girard keeps talking about Greek tragedy, looking for what Virgil is offering him. For some reason, I don't know that. I never heard, I don't remember ever hearing Girard talk about Virgil. It's unbelievable, because he would have, I'm convinced he could have, Virgil could have introduced an element there that would have changed his attitude.
Well, in defense of Girard, I must have to say, Professor Bandera, he did have to really do a lot of research before he could write things hidden since the foundation of the world. And back to violence and the sacred, he did have to struggle with Freud and deal with Freud and deal with structuralism. So it was a big struggle. He was wrestling with a lot of big theoreticians on a lot of different concepts. Yes. And he chose to focus on Greek tragedy. So
no, mind you, of course, yes, there is a limit to, you cannot study it. And no, but the point is that he asked of Greek tragedy, and he looks at Greek tragedy in the right way, which would have been, I can say that now, I didn't know this as I do it today, 40 years ago, when I was talking to him occasionally about him. He was looking at Greek tragedy precisely in the way that, had it been on Virgil, he would have discovered a new world. I didn't tell him so, because I did, you know, that thing was far from clear in my mind at the time. I simply suspected that, and I told him occasionally, but in passing, you should read Virgil, René, you should read Virgil. Yeah, I'm sure you're right, but, you know, okay.
Well, I think
so.
I think with Girard, you know, he was such a great thinker that when he was moving ahead, he couldn't come back. I mean, his trajectory of thoughts went just from book to book, and the different books show exactly what he was thinking. So when he started writing on Christianity, he didn't want to go back to think about classics anymore. He wanted to write about Christianity. And
yes,
that's what he did.
No. Mind you, I am a Girardian. I have been a Girardian all my life. Nobody has ever had the kind of impact on my intellectual outlook as René did. He was not only a dear friend, he was, you know, he was my intellectual guide. You know, it's. I wish I could write a book which would be, I am trying, but it's going to be very difficult, achieve these two things at the same time. One, he has been, well, as Michel said, the Darwin of the human sciences. Yes, you know, the great genius of the human sciences in the 20th century, no question in my mind about it. And at the same time, he made a terrible blindness. You know, there was another member in my doctoral committee at Cornell, which was this Belgian professor, what was his name, who wrote a book, famous book, Blindness and Insight. The name escapes me now. But the book that he wrote, could apply to some extent to the great genius. There was a blind spot. Maybe it's what you read. Maybe it was inevitable. Once you go from this book to the next, to the next, and to the next. Yes, because there was also something. This goes in the term of the anecdotal. You also asked if we could have some anecdotes. One of the things that told me that he was an exceptional mind. He could size up an idea, an argument, a situation, a person, the intellectual makeup of in an incredible short time, let me tell you a little anecdote. We were both listening to a lecture. I don't remember where. It was a big amphitheater type of lecture hall. I don't remember who the lecturer was either, but it must have been something important to judge by the size of the hall. And all I remember is that we were sitting together, René and I, and as it had happened several times, he fell asleep. He just fell asleep almost as soon as the lecture started. So the lecture ends, or it's about to end, and I nudged him to wake him up because, it would have been a little bit embarrassing if people would have fun. So he wakes up, hears literally the last few sentences, the last minute and a half of the lecture, no more. The lecture stops, open to question. He's the first to raise his hand and start asking the most relevant questions about the whole thing. He took over the stage and everybody was just talking about what he was asking the lecturer. And I was wondering in my mind, this guy never had more than 1 minute of the entire lecture. He could do it. He could do it, and I had with him some problems because of that. At the beginning, when he was, when we was already talking about violence and the sacred, when he was already talking about anthropology, and I didn't know fully what he was talking about. So sometimes I say, wait a second. What do you mean? I don't understand what you're saying. And he would get angry at me. What do you mean you don't understand? Of course you understand. It was, it had this tremendous ability to size up, what the whole thing is about. Is one of the things. We also discuss on a personal level, very occasionally. I would try to pull a little fun and make a little fun of him and joke about him. And although I never actually asked questions about his religious conversion, I knew that was, something he didn't want to talk about much, and I did not insist. But I don't remember what the conversation was. At some point, I was talking, half jokingly, about his saintliness, because that's another thing, and now I'm not joking. I am convinced he was a saintly man, literally, on a personal level, and how, exemplary and so on and so forth. And he said, well, even St. Augustine, the greatest saint, tells us all the bad things that he did. I was not that saintly. I was not that, I was not, I was not a nice guy all the time. So I said, what do you mean? You're not, well, I was expelled from school. And I said, René, you expelled from school? For what reason? No, of course, bad behavior. And that was it. I have no idea when this happened, what kind of bad behavior, but in a way that added to his saintliness, because he was telling me this out of humility. Let's say, don't make that much, I mean, nobody is perfect. Only our Father in heaven is perfect. Something to that effect. So he made that comment. I don't know, don't quote me on that unless you do it as a support. So not to discover that he had been expelled from school, but in order to emphasize what I want to emphasize, which was literally his saintly attitude, his humility, his enormous humility.
Professor Bandera, let me go back to violence and sacred and things hidden since the foundation of the world. I'm still a little bit upset about the fact that you were not happy with the fact that he didn't write the book on Christianity first. Were you happy, at least, were you happy the fact that he wrote Violence and the Sacred? Was that not an important book to contribute to the world?
Yes, absolutely.
And okay, my second question then would be, were you happy with things hidden since the foundation of the world? And did that justify his Christianity? Were you happy with that book? Did he come as a Christian, finally, in your opinion?
Well, yes, I was. I mean, if you want a simple answer, yes, absolutely. I am very happy with everything he wrote except the last one, Battling to the End. That really caught me by surprise. No, that I am not happy with. But unfortunately, you see, we had stopped communicating. Last time I saw him was at the last meeting of COV&R at Riverside, California. Battling to the End had just come out. I was horrified by it. And I wanted to talk to him about it, but he, to put it in his own words, I asked him, I wanted to approach the subject as gently as I could and said, well, René, another dialogue book? And I remember him saying, this one, I could not have done it on my own. I no longer have the energy. And that was it. I didn't go any further. So I never had an opportunity to discuss this with him. That with regard to Violence and the Sacred and things hidden since the foundation, yes, absolutely. I am extremely glad that those two books were written. But maybe basically this is, if you allow me just a little bit in my defense here. If you say, as he said numberless times, Christ reveals the injustice of blaming the victim for everything. There is the sins that belong to the entire group, put on the scapegoat. Okay? Christ came to denounce that. He said, no, you are responsible for that. You are killing an innocent human being. Okay. How did you go from there to the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world? Because that is what defines Christ. Christ is presented not the enemy, the one that comes to denounce the scapegoat mechanism. Christ is the one that comes to embody that mechanism, to make him his, which is why you have this aspect in the gospel over which René would go, it's nothing. It never had any serious importance for him. The suffering of Christ, Gethsemane, so excruciating was the personal suffering, he sweats blood, we are told. The abandonment, forsaken by the Father, these intimate things, because Christ is really taking the scapegoat mechanism, the victimizing thing, inside himself. He is not just pointing at it as something that, hey, you're guilty. No, I am taking, yes, you're going to see your guilt, but see what I do with your guilt. I make it mine, you know, and this is what it takes for an innocent man, the only innocent human being on the face of the earth ever, to take on your guilt. You know, it's even Christ have to plead with the Father, if at all possible, can you make this pass by?
Right, absolutely.
But where is that in René? That should have been at the center of it. It's nowhere. The Lamb of God is another example, a nice way of saying the scapegoat victim. No, it's a lot more than that, and you know it, René. That was my. Now, would I support things hidden in the foundation? Of course I do, because there is so much there. If he would only just, you know, turn the thing, I don't know exactly how, and I don't claim, you know, any particular kind of knowledge, but yes, with these corrections, yes, we need it. We need it. And besides, I am asking these questions today because of
he did expand on it in his book. I saw Satan fall like lightning.
Yes.
He does touch upon all these things in that book. Talk about it.
I don't remember exactly. Yes, that is with Barbieri, wasn't that?
That's actually no, it's just himself. There was not a dialogue. I saw Satan fall like lightning.
Yes, I'm looking. I may have it right here. No, okay. I'm sorry. Yes. I know. You know. Oh, I have it in online. How do you call it? An ebook and a Kindle. I have it. You know, yeah. Yes, not only there, but in other. I think also in. Quand ces choses commenceront, when these things
begin.
When these things begin. Another, he addresses this, the question of how he's going to fit his scientific view with theology. You know, for example, he says, you know, you have to begin, as I think he mentions this mystic, this French woman mystic.
Simone Weil. Simone Weil?
Simone Weil. And you need a good anthropology. There is a good anthropology in the Gospels. In other words, in addition to being the Word of God, you know, there is a treatise on man, which, yes, it's true. And he mentions, René was one of the things that he brought up frequently. You see, you have the two natures of Christ. You know, he's a man and he's God. You know,
Praise God.
and so anthropology, mimetic anthropology, is not only not inimical to theology, it complements theology. It's, you know, the two things are needed. Well, but that also means that the two things cannot contradict each other. Now, if what you say is correct, then you have to begin by collating, by explaining how the Lamb of God fits into the anthropological pattern of the denouncing of the victimizing of the victim. So I know he tried, because he knew that was the point of, you know, it was a weak point, that the whole project was vulnerable there. And of course, you know, my memory fails me, but in my book, I have a whole bunch of people who read René Girard attentively and sympathetically, and that kept saying, there is something missing here. Why it is about time that René, I'm thinking of one in particular, the name of whose name also escapes me, it's about time that Girard start talking theologically and trying to convince those scientists that he wants to please that theology has something anthropologically important to contribute from a theological point of view. In other words, the fact that Christ is the Lamb of God, and this is how it is defined theologically and by the faith, has a relevance anthropologically. And since, you know, you are providing the anthropological frame of reference, it is right there where it should go. You know, I'm not, you know, this has been it. This has been the genial insight, the incredible merit of Girard's work, and its vulnerable point.
Yes, I understand.
Whether you know, has anybody else done any better than he? Probably not. Probably not. But I don't feel that I am, or at least I don't want to sound like I am attacking him. I am pointing at something which is vulnerable, which becomes obvious because of what he said. And if he had not said it, probably nobody would know about it. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So we have to be grateful for everything that he said, but at the same time, and mind you, it was, he also knew, and I do mention that in my book, that when the chips are down, you know, it is your personal relationship with God that matters. Conversion, and he's obviously an expert on that, it doesn't make any difference what your intellectual posture is. You know, intellectually you could be here or there, it doesn't matter. You know, there is something deeper than that. You know, that gave him in other words, he was never dogmatic about his anthropology. You know, he could make fun of himself. He could use self-satire. He uses it in the Shakespeare book, imitating Shakespeare. He knows what self-satire is. He could, you know, take a distance, you know, make fun of himself. He did that, you know. It was part of it. You know, I heard not so long ago that there is, just like we have COV&R, there is apparently some organization, international scholar, on you know, what this British philosopher, you know, this Catholic, this example of irony. What was, my God? Oh,
Are you talking about James Allison?
no, I'm talking about, no, James Allison is a good friend of mine. No, talking about somebody that Chesterton, for heaven's sake. Chesterton. Somebody apparently is investigating the possibility of initiating a canonization of Chesterton, you know, making him a saint. I don't know if this is getting anywhere, or I have no idea, but I heard about it from some serious source. And as I told some of my colleagues at the funeral of René, if I have to vote on anybody to be made a saint, I would vote for René. And I mean it. I mean it. This is not me. You know, it's hard for me to talk about this without becoming emotional. So I will stop here. But you know, I wish I could write a book that were both a testimony of my great admiration for him, and at the same time to point out as clearly as I can where the vulnerable points are. I may not be able to do it, but I'm going to try.
It seems like, based on our discussion, it seems like you're pointing out the vulnerabilities are more or less in the theological realm.
Yes.
But he never considered himself a theologian anyway, so...
That's true, but...
He never claimed to be a theologian.
Yeah, I am not a theologian. I mean, even less of a theologian than he was. Nevertheless, he was talking about a very deep theological subjects. You see, that bothered Father Cesâreo. You know, that was also, you know, Father Cesâreo, who was a Girardian enthusiast, and he would try always his best to find ways to calm the waters with Catholic theologians, you know, to try to convince them that that they were not sinning by reading René Girard. I'm exaggerating. I'm making, but you know, he knew that it would not be easy to convince the theologians, and you know, and occasionally people who I thought, oh my God, this must have read René Girard. It must be. And all of a sudden, I mentioned René Girard, and you know, I said, I hate it. You know, some kind of theological reaction to that effect.
Well, he was a controversial figure all his life. As you mentioned right now, his last book really created a big controversy among people. So
indeed. But you know that it came to a head because there, I think well, no, this would take us very far. I think there is a difference. He renounces some of the things that he had said before.
Absolutely. Thanks to Raymond Schwager, thanks to the dialogue he had with Raymond Schwager, he renounced and recorrected himself in some of the things he said.
Sorry, thanks to what did you say? Raymond
Schwager. His dialogue with Raymond Schwager. He corrected it.
Yes, I understand what you're saying. Allow me to say that the influence of Father Cesâreo on him was, my impression is, less than what it has made to be. I don't want to go into that because I was a very good friend of Father Cesâreo myself. and I believe I understand what he was trying to do. And yes, he had some influence. He had some influence on Girard. At least he got Girard to the point where he would not openly say that the sacrifice of that Christ's passion, he would stop prohibiting people to say that it is sacrifice, that it was central for the church, for the Christian church, or at least the Catholic Church, to see the passion, death, and resurrection as sacrifice. That the word sacrifice wasn't going to be renounced. And finally, René bought into that. And yes, okay, so all right, I will accept that. But not much further than that. Schwager tried his best also to soften René's encounter with the letter to the Hebrews, which is openly and totally sacrificial. So I believe I understand how much of an effort both of them made to accommodate things that were very difficult to accommodate, and they had some degree of success. But the notion, allow me to doubt it, the notion that that the contact with Father Schwager really changed anything significant, substantial in René's thinking, my opinion is that was not so, not to that effect.
I see. I spoke to, René himself says Father Schwager had a very big impact on him. That was his own words. And
well, yeah, sure. Maybe that's it was just a feeling. There were some things, you see. I have some, in addition to the letter that I sent you, I have a few others of that same period, and they were, those letters, he tells me of practically everything that he was doing, everybody. He had been in Rome, he had met Calasso, and blah, blah. He went to the Geneva, the World Council of Churches, and everything. And not even mention Schwager, even though he had already, in the correspondence between the two that has been published, as you probably know. Yes. There were letters he tells me about this and this and this and this. Even when he was preparing our trip to Cerisy-La Salle, he was corresponding with Schwager and with me. And at some point, he tells Schwager, well, you see, I'm going to Cerisy with this Spanish-American friend of mine, and so on and so forth. Talking with me, I mean, he never even mentioned Schwager. It was much later, that I started, hearing him talk about Schwager and paying attention to him. Well, on the other hand, it was quite a few years later, he would write to me the first time he met Allison, James Allison. He told me, he wrote in this letter, I have to tell you, I met this British theologian. He gave me a thesis on the Holy Trinity. It's, you have to read it. You have to read it. I checked with James to see when was that, because I remember that what he said, but I don't have the letter. I didn't have the letter with me, and so he confirmed. Yeah, it was. On the summer, it was because this letter was addressed to me in Spain. It was in the summer of '91. He said, when I gave in Paris this copy of my thesis to René, and so on. So he confirmed to me. Anyhow, my point is that I had doubts about. I don't believe that Cesâreo had an influence, as I said, to the point where he would accept using what has been traditional in the church. Talk about the sacrifice of Christ, to which he was 100% opposed before. He accepted it. So yes, in that regard, but is that, does that go to the bottom of things? I'm not sure. But
That's a big deal, though.
Maybe you're right.
Professor Bandera, I think that's a very big deal, considering things since the foundation of the world made a big scandal all over the world, because René was talking about this is non-sacrificial. It's a complete 180 degrees repentance of terminology and thoughts, so a conversion, so to say. So
yes, at the level of yes, yeah, you know, I don't want to. Yes, you're probably right. You know, I think that. You know,
let me ask you: of all the books that René wrote, which one is your favorite?
Oh my goodness,
that's a good question to ask you.
It is very difficult. It is very difficult. I think the evolution and conversion.
The last one. Well, not the last one.
Close to the last
one.
Close
to the last one. Yeah.
This is probably the most overall comprehensive.
Comprehensive. I agree.
Yes. You know, this is, if we are to select one book in which more of René is reflected, that would probably be my choice.
You like that more than Mensonge Romantique?
Well, you know, Mensonge Romantique is the privilege of being the beginning of it all. No, as far as the immediate influence of René on my work, Mensonge Romantique was it. You know, I was a literary man, and when I saw what I saw, I said, you know, this is it. You know, I had been studying the Quixote, and when I finally wrote Mimesis Conflictiva, I asked him to write my prologue, which he did, because, you know, it was all Girardian. That was back in 74, 75, you know, and this was the entryway. I did write a review of his first three books, Mensonge Romantique, Violence Sacrée, and The Chose Cachée, for this journal at Johns Hopkins, Modern Language Notes, I think it was, explaining the way I saw the transition from the literary Girard to the anthropology, and I was trying to show that there is a perfectly logical passage from one to the other. Incidentally, it was also at that time which these vicious, really vicious attack on René had happened, you know, this Hayden White. Yeah. And this thing that was published at Cornell, okay, I forgot. He attacked. He must be a Nazi sympathizer. He was accusing him of that, you know. And René was really hurt. I mean, he didn't expect. He was used to people attacking him, but not to that extent, you know. So he more or less asked me, without openly asking, to say something, since I was preparing this review of his at that time, you know, say something about this vicious thing, which I did. I more or less, to answer or react to both your question, that he found enemies on right and left because he didn't fit anywhere.
Yeah.
He didn't fit anywhere. And also comparing Mensonge romantique with his anthropology. No, I don't think that Mensonge romantique is, on the whole, more important, than either La Violence or Sincidem. So I don't know. To me, it doesn't really make much sense. You have to take all of them. You have to see how one thing goes into the other.
Right. The first three books came out as a complete set in France, where the first publisher published it. Absolutely. So you personally were not that surprised when he went from Mensonge romantique to La Violence et le Sacré?
No, well, yes, on a superficial level, yes, because I mean it was changing from literature to anthropology.
Yeah,
it was a big change, and yes. On the other hand, you have to begin with mimetic theory.
Yes.
You cannot understand violence and the sacred unless you understand mimetic desire. Sure. And hypermimetic desire if you're going to understand the scapegoat mechanism. So sure. It's a perfectly logical, easy way to go from one to the other. Right. Now, on the outer surface, sure, it's a huge change. This literary critic, but at the center of both is that one of the things, particularly at the time that Mensonge romantique came up, he found meaning, real meaning, in literary fiction. In other words, he was trying to say, these fictions are modern fictions. Yeah. These metaphors, etc., this literary rhetoric refers to something very real.
Absolutely.
You see?
Absolutely.
And because of, it refers to something very real, and he was paying very close attention to Cervantes and to Shakespeare and to Dostoevsky, he came up with the scapegoat mechanism, which was no longer a literary thing. This thing, if it was true, it had to have happened. It had to be a real thing.
Real, absolutely.
It only makes sense if it is real.
Real, absolutely.
And absolutely. That's what went against somebody like Hayden White, who was an aestheticist. Something. There's nothing but text. And beyond the text, I've still further text, and everything is intertextuality. And René would say, well, everything is intersubjectivity. Everything is a web of desire. But when you do get to that, then you're going to get eventually to the scapegoat mechanism for real.
Yes.
In other words, the violence that you portray in fiction, you think you can keep it at the fictional level,
but you can't. It becomes real. Real.
And in fact, what I have been trying to say on my own all the time is that is precisely, my last book is A Refuge of Lies. This is from Isaiah. He's addressing those mockers in Jerusalem. You think you have made a pact with the overwhelming force, with the devil, with violence, with overwhelming violence, but it is all based on fiction. In other words, you think you can take refuge in fiction.
Yeah. You
cannot. But fiction begins with, in tragedy, in Homer. This is what Auerbach was telling about the Homeric style, as opposed to the the style of the Old Testament, the Abrahamic style, to put it in some words. Homer is not only not interested in the truth. Auerbach noticed that he does not deliberately want to touch the truth, because the truth is that which is most dangerous.
Are you familiar with the exchange of letters between Sandy Goodhart and René Girard? They had an exchange of...
some, but I'm aware of many exchanges between Sandy and yes. I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but
I was told that Sandy Goodhart was the one who brought the Judeo side of things to René.
Yes, of course. And the point of Sandy is that basically everything is already in Isaiah, and if you read Isaiah, you're reading Christ.
So okay. René did not know that before Sandy introduced him to Isaiah?
What did René know that?
Yeah.
I suppose he did. I suppose I don't know, but Sandy's right. But not everything is there. In other words, René noticed, and that's one of the things that he wanted for Sandy to realize or to understand. When he talks about the scapegoat mechanism and so forth, he's jumping back over the Old Testament. In other words, there is more in common between what he sees, what René sees in the sacrifice of Christ, and the sacrificial beginning with the sacrificial crisis and the killing of the victim. Those two things across the ages are more closely reflecting each other than what lies in the middle, which is Abraham and the Old Testament. See what I mean? That's what I believe René has been was trying to tell Sandy. I must confess that it is after, when things were beyond, too late, that one begins to realize, in my case, the depth of my attachment to René and his attachment to me. There's a few weeks ago, somebody else interviewed me on the same topic. He's doing a documentary on René. And I also showed him the letter that I showed you, and so because that, in a way, says more than I can describe. And his reaction made me think. He said, "Yes, he loved you, and yes, he did," and that made me feel guilty, because I never really measured the depth of what was going on between the two of us. I think he knew that because he was far more intelligent than I ever was. No, I think that he knew that better than I did. You see, I never used to, and I realize that now. You see, I didn't think of those things. I never used with him the kind of language that he uses with me in the letter that you saw. Yes, this guy that told me he loved you. Yes, he did. Otherwise, he would not have written those things the way he did. And how come I never noticed that? I should have noticed when he was alive, when I could have responded in kind. I don't know. I never did. I never did. And, you know, that's something I just have to live with. But yes, he was quite a man. He was quite a man, quite a human being. No question about it.
Well, we could pray for him at this point.
Yes, I do.
That's what I do.
Yes, so do I. So do I.
He's alive in all of our hearts, and he's in heaven right now.
Yes.
That's what I believe. So
I do too. I do too. I have no doubt about that. I have no doubt.
I have no doubt either. So,
you know,
as a Catholic, I know I can pray.
Yes.
That's the best thing we can do.
Yes.
And you have time to write your book on him, but you could put.
I hope. I hope. I passed an earlier version in which I was far more harsh, which is far more stupid than that was needful, and it created a little bit of a scandal, and so I'm rewriting everything.
And created a bit of a scandal between who?
You know, a few readers that I sent them to. I sent this draft of a manuscript to.
I see.
Because I had my doubts, and so I wanted a few trusted friends who knew René very well, and to react to this. And the reaction was, yeah, well, it taught me a lesson. So I'm rewriting the whole thing in the hope that I can combine these two things: my deep admiration and depth to the scholar, to the intellect and the man that he was, and at the same time to, admonish him and say, René, you should have thought of this. You should have said this. You know.
There, Professor Bandera, I think you need to be a little bit more gentle there, because I think he had a lot on his mind, and he was a big thinker, so he couldn't think about every detail.
Yeah, but don't you think it would sound a little silly if I say that in a book? Say, well, okay, all right, you said this or that, but I forgive you because you had so many other things to take care of. That would not be an homage to him.
That would be ridiculous. That would be quixotic if you do that. That would be like Don Quixote. But you could do it in a more delicate way.
Yes. I agree. That is what I'm trying. That is what I'm trying to say.
Well, ask you: did he have an influence on your Catholicism? Did he make you a better Catholic?
Yes, I understand. No, not really. I mean, he simply confirmed, gave intellectual backing to many things that I had always taken for granted, or that I never really thought much about. No, I have wondered about that myself occasionally, but no, I never had the kind of experience that either you or he had. No, it was just...
So it's more an intellectual camaraderie. It was not a spiritual one.
Yes, but also at the same time combined, and that's what I realize now more and more, combined with a personal attachment, with something, Freccero was right when he said, you and René will connect. You and René, you have to meet this friend of mine at Johns Hopkins who has written this wonderful book about Mensonge Romantique. You have to read that because that's what, that fits you. He was prophetic. He was prophetic because we felt, both René and I felt, that we had connected. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be meeting practically every single day for lunch, to talk for about half an hour, 45 minutes.
This was at Cornell.
No. You see,
at Buffalo.
At Buffalo, yes.
At Buffalo.
He arrived in Buffalo in 68.
68.
I arrived in Buffalo in 69. Okay. One of the reasons why I accepted Buffalo's offer is because he was already there.
I see.
Yeah, that was, even though I had only met him personally at this dinner party at Frecciero's house, but I had already read Mensonge Romantique, and I said, yes, this is my guy. There is something here which fits perfectly well.
So you got to know Martha as well, pretty well.
Oh, yeah.
And his children and the whole family.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I have a little recollection. This happened in Vienna. I don't remember the year that the cover meeting took place at Graz, and we had traveled to Vienna, and we were sitting, my wife, Esther, Martha, Girard, and myself, on a park bench in front of the German Imperial Palace. It was a beautiful day, and we started talking, about Girard and Girard's stuff. And I mentioned what I had already said to him so many times, that I didn't see how he could keep these two things separate, his religious faith from his anthropology. And to my great surprise, because Martha is the epitome of the amiable, sweet lady, I had never seen her that way. She reacted like, a woman who jumped out in defense of her man. I mean, I wouldn't say violently, but in a tone like saying, no, you are right, Cesáreo. That's not, of course he can, you see, I thought at the moment, oh my goodness, I didn't think so much. Her attitude surprised me, but I thought of, that's how firmly he wants to keep the two things separate, because even his wife, jumps out in his defense that way.
Yes.
That's, other than that, Martha has always been, we still have some, my wife has some things that Martha gave her, and, we were pretty close, yes.
Yes.
And, I didn't know Martin, because the oldest one, because he was already out of the nest, practically. But married, his daughter, I remember when she was a little girl, she used to call her ma poupée, my doll, my doll. That's how he referred to her. And what was the one in between Martin and Mary? I don't remember his name. Daniel, yes, Daniel, who became a lawyer, I believe, when
yes,
was working in San Francisco, around the Bay there. We were there many times. I took, at least once, I took my son Pablo, whom you should, he's one of the new Girardians. Oh, you should read this. He's a physicist.
Oh.
You should read, his little book on Girard and this new kind of physics, you know, how do you call it? Not nuclear physics. Quantum physics. Quantum physics. You know, you should read the book. You know, I mean, he's quoted now by the Raven Foundation and so forth. You know, he has become a little bit of a celebrity within the Girardian crowd. But he has some very interesting things to say about quantum theory, and you know, some suggestion of why is it that bodily, the resurrected body of Christ, you know, he was not a ghost. He was not, you know, he asked Thomas, touch me, touch my wound. I'm for real.
Yeah.
Yet people who had been with him daily, who knew him personally, did not recognize him at first. You know, he had to say something. It was later on, it was a process, more than a physical process of recognition. Oh my God, it was the master we were talking to. The disciples, the two disciples going on the road to Emmaus and so forth. Mary, you know, who thought it was the gardener tilling the grounds, it was the master. My son thinks that there is a physical basis for that, if you take account not of traditional physics but of quantum physics. You know,
that's fantastic.
Yeah. So you know, I'm fascinated by this. He could have stayed longer on this project and come up with a more but anyhow, he had enough to please Ted Johnson to publish the same. So you should read it. You should read it.
Professor Bandera, if René had not insisted on anthropology right from the beginning, we would have never had science coming out of literature.
Probably so. Probably.
We never had Mensonge Romantique leading to science. It would have remained in the literature realm. He had to make it anthropology, which is a clear cut. And then theology, then psychology, then we had interdividual psychology with Jean-Michel Hougourlan.
Yes.
And then we had science coming in. If he was not adamant about it, we would have never had these new areas. He had to be adamant about it.
You're probably right. You know, yes, what can I say? You know, but, you know, Hougourlan is one of those who questioned him about, you know, okay, René, you see, yes, I believe you say that we know all this because there is this underground working of the Christian revelation and so on and so forth. But the thing is that we have reached a stage in which we do not have to rely on any revelations anymore. Yeah. You know, it's what somebody has called the Hougourlan paradox. René never had an answer to that. Incidentally, I attended some of their meetings because even though the Short Cachet was published after he went back to Johns Hopkins, but they had been added before he left Buffalo. And I would join them occasionally at this hotel, I think it was a Sheraton, in the town of Cheektowaga, south of Buffalo. And at that time, they had not decided how they would call this book.
Right.
So he said, I think it was Hougourlan who said, well, let's call it Les Entretiens de Cheektowaga. You know, it's sort of more or less jokingly. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. But, you know, I also believe that somebody has to say what I have to say, because I know that there are people thinking about those things. You know, I mean, they are fairly obvious. Where is the Lamb of God, René? Where is the Lamb of God? Where is Gethsemane?
Right.
You have to go into that, you know.
Well, if it makes you happy, this is in retrospect, he really liked the film The Passion because
Oh, Gibson.
Mel
Yes,
Gibson.
yeah, yes, I did too. I did like it. I did, which I never thought I would, because I never thought I would like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, but I think it was done with taste. The fact that, for instance, I mean, the use of Latin there, it kind of keeps things a little bit.
The only problem with that film was the fact that Gibson didn't show the resurrection at the end. He just showed the torture and the suffering and the passion, but he didn't show the resurrection.
It would have been very, very difficult. It would have been, how would you show the resurrection?
Well, of course, he comes back to life after he gets crucified.
Oh, yes, but how do you fictionalize that? It's very easy to fictionalize the violence. That will always go for. That's easy. But the resurrection, the totally non-violence, that's beyond the power of fiction, I think. I think that's one of the difficulties.
Why? You show the fact that you roll the rock away from the tomb, and the tomb is empty. And Mary Magdalene comes.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, not the resurrection itself, which in a way nobody can see, nobody saw. No. But the empty tomb.
Empty tomb.
Yes. I don't remember. So he didn't show that.
No.
I didn't remember.
He just showed the passion and the torture and the violence, and Christ getting killed, getting scapegoated.
Yeah, he should have shown the empty tomb.
But the whole crux of Christianity is that Jesus gets resurrected.
Of course, the power. That's what St. Paul said. You know, if Christ did not resurrect, all our faith is in vain.
Exactly. Did you hear about the fact that René wanted to write a book on St. Paul at one point? Did you talk to him about that?
No, not that I remember.
Because last that I spoke to him, he said he wanted to write a book on St. Paul, and then eventually Battling to the End came out instead. So apparently...
I see. No. That was, how would I say, past my time.
Yeah.
In the time in which, because before his death, we had been without contact for a number of years.
I see.
I heard from some people who had tried to go there and interview him, and people who had known him for a very long time, and came back saying, at least I heard some of them say, it was impossible. His mind was already wandering. No, I was not aware, but I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all, you know. Yeah. Because of course St. Paul he relies so much on. It's interesting because it shows a little bit his change of attitude. He made a point of at the beginning regarding the letter to the Hebrews to say that it was hard for him to believe that St. Paul had written it. So he was siding with those that didn't think it was St. Paul. But then towards the end, if there was, I can't remember exactly where, but there were a couple of occasions in which I was reading him and I was surprised. Oh, so now he admits that this could be St. Paul also. But the letter to the Hebrews is the touchstone of his relation to relation to the whole gospel, really. Yeah. So I'm not surprised that he would write directly on a particular text in St. Paul in particular.
Okay, Professor Bandera, thank you so much for taking the time for this conversation. Really appreciate it, and I hope to see you soon once this pandemic is over.
I hope so, and I hope you will have a tremendous success with this tribute.